I'm Lindsay Knudsen, and I'm here to talk about what I see like being a high school student. So my friends, and including myself, like sometimes we struggle with anxiety and depression, whether it's juggling extracurriculars and having fear of what's to happen in the future. And when those times come, you have to lean on God. I encourage you to lean on God because He promises us that He will be with us every single step of the way. If He is with us, then who can be against us? And that is the hope that I have and that I remind myself every day, is that no matter what, He's going to be with us, and like He's always going to be there, and He's bigger than anything you can ever imagine. And so I encourage you to keep that with yourself throughout all your life.
Yeah. So Lindsay, I could just listen to Lindsay and be convinced because of Christ living inside of you, Lindsay, and I'm totally stoked about that. Depression, some of that is actually physical. We actually feel it. It's biological. It comes through our bodies, but some of it is a thought process. It's giving beliefs to imagined ideas and thinking the worst about things and stuff like that. And God changes the direction of our hearts, and He changes our perspective. And Pastor Adam from your church, from Restoration Church, he's going to be sharing about anxiety and depression and how God changes our perspective on these things and moves us toward hope and reassurance in Christ. And we're going to give it over to Pastor Adam.
I want to tell you a story about a pastor that I know. A pastor that, if you looked at his life from the outside, looked like everything was going well. Good family, had a good ministry. Everything from the outside looked great. But this pastor that I knew had a ton of anxiety. In fact, he was super discouraged. Things at home were not as they seemed. His marriage was as troubled as it had ever been. Things behind closed doors at the church and his ministry were as bad as they'd ever been. Bickering and fighting and discontent and discontentiousness. It was just difficult. This pastor that I knew was super discouraged. And that discouragement actually ended up leading to despair, meaning that at that moment, he just didn't think it would ever get better. At that moment, he thought it was a life sentence. Can you start to relate just a little bit, even if you're not a pastor? This pastor friend that I know had discouragement that went to despair, that went beyond that. And he realized that one day when he was sitting at a red light on Rivers Avenue. And at that red light, he was worried about everything, discouraged, again, despair. And he looked to the left and he saw this giant dump truck coming down. And the giant dump truck was coming down the road pretty quickly, loaded with those big giant rocks you'd see like at a ditch, those big giant white ones. And he knew it was a lot of weight at a lot of velocity. And at that moment, he had that thought, the thoughts that we don't like to talk about, that if I go ahead and pull out now, it'll all be over. It'll all be done. This pastor that I knew, he was at that moment where despair had actually gone to a little bit of depression. The whole moment lasted about 5-6 seconds. Obviously, he didn't pull out, but he knew something was wrong. And he knew he needed to talk to somebody. He knew he needed to get help. Now, I realize you may not be a pastor and you're watching this, but in this season of our lives right now, where the obvious anxiety and the obvious unknown about what we're going through right now, maybe you're worried about that. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. But you can relate to that pastor who was discouraged and even maybe have moved to despair or even depression. Maybe yours is circumstantial. Maybe it goes beyond that. Listen, I want to share with you the spiritual side of those things. I want to acknowledge right up front that I know depression is a big, big spectrum that goes from spiritual, that goes to circumstantial, that goes to physiological, that goes all types of things that I can't speak to. No matter what you're going through right now, I want to encourage you to get help, and we'll have some resources at the end of this to tell you how to do that. But today, I just want to speak to the spiritual side of that. Because if you get help with the other parts of it, the physical, the physiological, if you get help from the professionals, and you should, but don't address the spiritual, you won't have complete healing and you won't have the complete peace that you're looking for. By the way, if we've never met, my name's Adam. I'm a pastor over at Restoration Community Church, and I want to just share with you that even though you might be going through anxiety, discouragement, despair, depression, you're not alone. In fact, this has been going on for years and years and centuries, actually since the history of mankind. There's a guy I want to share with you in scripture today. His name's Jeremiah. You may know Jeremiah because he's the one who recorded this verse, Jeremiah 29:11. You might remember, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you. That guy. All right, the same guy that wrote that, actually one book later in the Bible, actually writes a book called Lamentations, where he's lamenting over his circumstances. Listen, where he too has moved from discouragement to despair to depression, all wrapped up with this anxiety of his circumstances. He's looking and he's saying, God, where are you? God, are you even around there? God, why don't you fix this? You have brought this time in my life upon me, and I don't know what to do. But then he remembers. I want to read this to you. It's Lamentations 3:19. Jeremiah, again, frustrated with his circumstances. Maybe you can relate to what he says here. The thought of my suffering and agony is bitter beyond words. Listen, maybe you're tuning in right now, and this moment in life, this season of your life right now is bitter beyond words. Listen, maybe I can't relate to you. Maybe your parents can't relate to you. Maybe your spouse can't relate to you. Maybe your friends can't relate to you. Jeremiah can relate to you. He says, my suffering is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time. Listen to this. As I grieve my loss. My pastor friend that I was telling you about was grieving the loss of everything that he thought was an idol to him. His marriage, his ministry, he was losing control of all that. He was losing respect, he was losing affirmation. Maybe you have lost something. Maybe it goes beyond that. Maybe you too have lost a relationship, maybe have lost some security. Maybe you've lost a loved one, and you too are in a moment of despair and even depression. He goes on. He says, yet I dare to hope. I'm asking you to lean into this. Here's what he says. Yet I dare to hope when I remember this. Here's what he says in verse 22. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin new each morning. Here's a man who had gone from discouragement to despair to depression, all wrapped up with anxiety. And here he is saying, my situation is bitter beyond words. But then he starts to remember. He starts to remember the goodness of God. And I realize that not everyone tuning in right now, I understand that you don't even know who God is. I'm so glad you're watching. I want to have an opportunity for you to engage a little bit deeper and learn more about God. But if you are watching and you have been told who God is, you know who God is, listen, I want to give you 3 things that God might be doing right now in the midst of your depression. Ready? 3 things. I want you to write these down. Maybe he's teaching you. Maybe he's teaching you about who you are. Maybe he's teaching you that life isn't about us. Maybe he's teaching you about who he is. Maybe this is an opportunity that God is slowing you down, is clearing everything out of the way so that he can teach you something. The second thing he might be doing is he might be humbling you. You know, my pastor, that friend that I was telling you about, he needed to be humbled. He needed to be humbled, and God was moving in his life, yes, through discouragement, yes, through despair and anxiety and depression, yes. But he was also humbling him. He was humbling because he was learning, my pastor friend was learning that life wasn't about him. And then number 3, this is so important. Maybe God is taking away idols in your life, and what you're grieving is the loss of that idol. Maybe that idol is a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's financial security. Whatever it is, maybe that thing that you're grieving, the loss of, is actually an idol that God in his goodness and graciousness has taken away. You say, why would he do that? Because he loves you and he wants you to worship him alone. And if he sees an idol in your life that is preventing you from an intimate relationship with him, he's loving enough and he's caring enough that he would actually remove that even in your discouragement, your despair, and your depression. So what do you do? What do you do right now? Yeah, God may be teaching you some things. God may be teaching you some things in your discouragement, despair, and depression, but what do you do? All right, let's look at what Jeremiah did. Number 1, he called to mind the goodness of God. Did you see what he said in verse 21? In verse 21, he said, yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. He remembers the truth about who God is. And again, I know there's people watching today and you don't know who God is. I'm so thankful that you've tuned in. And again, I'm going to give you a next step for you at the very end of this message. But the first thing we do is we recall the goodness of God. The second thing I want to encourage you to do, when you wake up tomorrow, ask God, God, what are you trying to teach me? What are you trying to teach me, and what do I need to learn? Maybe about who I am and about who you are. The third thing I want you to do is realize that God does ultimately have a good plan for you and blessings for you. Remember, this is the same God, Jeremiah, who wrote what God said, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. This is the same prophet who said that. Listen, let me encourage you. God does have a plan, and He does have a purpose for you. And oftentimes, He will use our seasons of despair and discouragement and depression and anxiety to get our attention so that we will learn those plans that He has for us. And then finally, what do? Especially if you're right now in a season of despair and discouragement and anxiety, what do? You wake up tomorrow morning and you look for God's blessings. You wake up tomorrow morning and you ask God, God, show me your goodness while you thank Him for what is clearly seen. Thank God for who He is. Thank God for loving you. And that even in your moments of despair and discouragement and depression and anxiety, He has not left you. That pastor friend I was telling you about, that was me. That was me, and I'm telling you, I can't relate with everything you're going through, but I know that God works even in those moments of discouragement, despair, and depression. I know He does. And even in those moments of anxiety, when He starts to strip away our control, He starts to strip away those idols, He's doing it because He loves us. He's doing it because He loves you, and He has a plan for you. Listen, if you're a follower of Christ, let me ask you to lean into the goodness of God. Know that He does have a plan for your life, and know that even during this time of despair and discouragement, depression, anxiety, He is working, and He's likely trying to get your attention and trying to teach you about who you are and who He is. I also want you to tune in next week as we continue to talk about this time that we find ourselves in and how to overcome fear, anxiety, depression. And next week specifically, we'll be talking about fear. I want you to tune in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but He brought me in. Oh, His love for me. Oh, His love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, He has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, He died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child
Hey, I'm Will, and I'm a middle schooler here in the Low Country. And wasn't it just an amazing message from Pastor Adam? He just really spoke on anxiety and depression and the things that people are struggling with, especially middle schoolers and high schoolers and youth at my age. And there's always a way to overcome it, and that there's actually 365 verses about like fear and how to overcome it, and God says not to fear. So I don't think necessarily it was a coincidence, but God planned this because every day we have a verse to help us overcome this stuff. Joshua 1 says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So when we're struggling with anxiety and depression, when we've fallen into that hole, but God is always there, and He's always giving us a hand, and He can reach you up. God is always welcome to bringing you into His kingdom. What do you think?
Oh man, that was incredible. I mean, hanging out with people like this, I'd be encouraged, wouldn't you? I'd be hopeful if I hung out with this dude every day of my life, because the real reason is because he knows that he has hope in Jesus, but he also has the ability to overcome with his faith by turning his life over again and again and again to God. All those things that cause fear, all those things that cause anxiety, to turn those things back over to God. Let God fight those battles for him, and rest in the knowledge that I'm loved, rest in the knowledge that I'm wanted, rest in the knowledge that my life is secure with God. Will, thanks for sharing that. And Will, we hope that everybody will stick through for the third and the fourth session too, because we're headed in a great place. And one of those places is to offer you the opportunity to respond to God. One of those places that we're going to is this place where faith can meet truth, where what we're sharing with you could call you into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. We want you to do that. And why you think, oh wait, I didn't want religion to come knocking at my door here today. That's not what's happening. This is people that care about you, people that love you from the Low Country that are saying, hey look, I'm winning with Jesus Christ in my life. I'm living an abundant life. The thief comes to destroy and to kill and to steal. But I have come that you might have life and have it to abundance, Jesus says in John chapter 10. So stick around for lesson number 3, where we're dealing specifically about fear from Pastor Russell.
Hello everyone. Thank you again for watching these videos. If you have not seen them all, I'd encourage you to go back. The first one is overcoming worry. The second one is overcoming anxiety and depression. The third one is overcoming fear. And the fourth one is where we get our hope in, which we know is Jesus Christ. So I encourage you to send this link to as many people that you can think of that really need to hear this message. The second thing I'd like to tell you is we are going to have a true revival sometime in the fall. Once we know when, it's going to take place in Hanahan, South Carolina. So be looking for that so we can come together person to person and really embrace each other and listen to these messages in person. The third thing I'd like to mention to you is that if you want to make that connection today, you want to make a decision, you're going to take out your phone and you're going to dial 46322. Type in 46322 and then scroll down and you're going to hit FCA 1528. Again, that's FCA 1528. You will get an automated message for your next steps in Jesus Christ. What are you waiting on? Do it today.